The story of Michael Ross is not just a chronicle of a killer, it is a descent into a dark. The story begins in the rural, quiet stretches of Connecticut in 1959. To understand the monster, one must first look at the garden in which he grew. Michael was born into a house that was never a home. His parents, Daniel and Patricia, were bound by a marriage of necessity. A high school pregnancy in a time when shame was a social death sentence. Patricia was a woman lost in the fog of severe mental illness, drifting in and out of psychiatric wards. When she was home, her presence was felt through physical and psychological abuse. But the deepest wound came from his uncle. In the eyes of young Michael, his uncle was a protector, a confidant. Yet, behind closed doors, this man became Michael's primary abuser, subjecting him to repeated sexual trauma from the age of 8. This created a horrific psychological short circuit. Michael learned that those who love you are also those who hurt you. When his uncle eventually took his own life, Michael was left with a distorted blueprint of human connection, one where love, sex, and violence were inseparable. The Ivy League mask. By the late 1970s, it seemed Michael Ross had escaped his past. He was a brilliant student at the prestigious Cornell University studying agricultural economics. He was a fraternity brother, a social climber, and a man who appeared to have a bright future in the very soil he grew up on. But beneath the tailored clothes and the academic accolades, the entity was waking up. He sought out the most beautiful women on campus, driven by an obsessive need for a perfect life. When his fiancée aborted their child to pursue her own dreams, the rejection acted as a catalyst. The repressed rage toward his mother and the trauma from his uncle boiled over. During his university years, Michael began his shadow life. He became a predator in the dorms and on the campus paths, admitting years later that he raped multiple women, none of whom reported him, buried under the silence and stigma of that era. The roadside stranglers reign. In 1981, the mask slipped entirely. Michael graduated and entered the professional world, but his true work began on the highways. He became the roadside strangler, a predator who viewed the world as a hunting ground. The first life taken, Hyo Sun Jun. Eung was a fellow Cornell graduate. Michael lured her to a scenic gorge in New York for a friendly walk. There, the friend became a fiend. He assaulted her and then, in a trance-like state, felt his hands tighten around her throat. After dumping her body, he fell into a brief, hollow depression, not out of empathy for June, but out of a narcissistic fear of what he had become. The system's blindness. Shortly after, he was caught in Illinois trying to kidnap a 16-year-old girl. He had his hands over her mouth in the woods when police intervened, in one of the greatest legal failures in history. Because he hadn't yet completed the assault, he was fined a mere $500 and given probation. To Michael, this wasn't a warning. It was a permission slip. The innocence lost. The list of names grew, each a vibrant life snuffed out by a man who felt he was above the law. Tammy Williams, 17, taken while walking home. Robin Stavinsky, 19, a hitchhiker who made the fatal mistake of trusting a man in a car. Then came the story of Paula Pereira. Paula was a 16-year-old girl struggling with her own demons. She was a victim of school bullying. Her classmates cruelly nicknamed her after the medication she took to cope with her depression. To avoid the torment on the school bus, she started hitchhiking. She thought she was being brave, taking control of her life. Instead, she stepped into the car of a monster. Michael dismembered her remains and left them in a swamp, a final indignity to a girl who only wanted to be left in peace. The officer and the blue Toyota. Michael's arrogance eventually became his undoing. In 1982, he targeted a woman in Ohio. He used a ruse, a broken car, and a request for a flashlight. He didn't know he was entering the home of a pregnant, off-duty police officer. When he attacked, her training took over. She fought with a ferocity that terrified him. For the first time, the predator felt like prey. He fled, but the officer had seen his face in his car. Even then, he killed again. While on bail for the attack on the officer, he murdered Deborah Taylor while her husband was away getting gasoline for their stalled car. The end finally came in 1984. Michael kidnapped Wendy Barryboat in broad daylight. He had become so convinced of his own invincibility that he didn't care who saw him. Witnesses described a thin man in glasses driving a blue Toyota. Police narrowed down thousands of owners until they found Michael Ross. When they squeezed him in the interrogation room, the entity collapsed. He began to confess, naming girl after girl, including two 14-year-olds, April Brunet and Leslie Shelley, whom he had murdered on Easter Sunday. The long walk to the needle. For 2 decades, Michael Ross sat on death row. He became a polarizing figure. He wrote a book, It Is Time for Me to Die, where he described his crimes not as choices, but as the work of an uncontrollable sexual sadistic drive. He eventually gave up his appeals, a move that sparked intense legal debate. Was he genuinely remorseful, or was this his final way of controlling the narrative? As Faris Ashur reflects on this, he offers a profound warning. We often label such men as crazy to distance ourselves from them. We use mental illness as a blanket excuse for evil. But Fares, speaking from his own 4 years of psychological treatment, rejects this. He argues that mental illness usually makes people more vulnerable and more compassionate because they know the weight of pain. To blame a serial killer's actions on depression is an insult to every person fighting for their mental health. A philosophy of kindness. The story of Michael Ross ends in a sterile room on May 13, 2005. He was the first person executed in Connecticut in decades. His final words were an admission of a debt he could never repay. But the true conclusion of this story lies in the lesson Fares Ashur leaves for his audience. He reminds us that the world is heavy enough. We do not need to add to the weight with our judgments or our sharp tongues. Watch your words. You never know if the person you are talking to is at their breaking point. Ask, don't judge. Instead of critiquing someone's appearance or mood, ask, are you okay? Choose peace. Kindness is free, yet it is the most valuable thing we can give. Michael Ross took 8 lives and left a trail of broken families. We cannot bring them back, but we can honor their memory by choosing to be the light in a world that, for them, turned far too dark. As Fares says, the world moves on whether we are here or not. So, while we are here, let's move it with a kind word. Let's move it with a hug. Let's move it with love. Next step. Would you like me to provide a list of the victims and their stories to serve as a memorial, or perhaps more detail on the legal changes that occurred after this case? I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.